Still, many people, whether they are of the philosophy of Buddhism or atheism or Christianity or whatever, they still do not recognize that when they turn their children over to government schools or public schools, they are being taught, trained, and indoctrinated into a certain way of thinking and reality for 6 hours per day, 5 days per year.
Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few, US PI's weekly podcast that empowers parents to reclaim their children's education from government bureaucrats and social engineers, equipping you with the tools and resources needed to join the cause.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few. Today I'm honored to welcome a giant in the world of homeschooling research, Dr. Brian Ray, founder and president of NHERI, which stands for the National Home Education Research Institute. Before we dive in, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating or a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe. And visit uspi.org to learn more and join the movement.
Today's episode is brought to you by US parents involved in education. US PI's mission is to empower parents and local communities to break free from federal and national influences, thereby reclaiming parental authority over their children's education. For more insights from US parents involved in education, connect with us at USPI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspi.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few, and I'm joined today by Dr. Brian Ray, the founder and president of NHERI, the National Home Education Research Institute. So for more than 3 decades, NHERI has served as the leading research organization documenting homeschooling trends, outcomes, demographics, and the broader influence of home-based education worldwide. Their work has provided parents, policymakers, courts, and educators with data and facts rarely seen when discussing home education. Dr. Brian Ray, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Sherry. It's great to be here.
So let's start at the beginning. What prompted you to found NHERI 35 years ago, and what gap did you
Yes.
see in the research landscape that needed filling?
Well, back at the time, I had just finished my doctoral studies at Oregon State University. 5 years before that, Sherry, I think you should know and everybody should know, I started the journal Homeschool Researcher, which is now 40 years old. It's become a peer-reviewed journal. So while I was working on my doctoral studies, I was poking around looking for, all of a sudden there were more and more people talking about starting school later with your children or not going to school. But at that time, there were very few. Dr. Patricia Lines thinks that by the 1970s, there were only 15,000 homeschool children. But I looked for research and there was very little done. By 1990, things were starting to grow a little bit in the homeschool movement, and others and myself thought, it's time to start a focus on research on home education. So a few other men and I just started the nonprofit, and we called it National Home Education Research Institute. That's it. At the time, again, very few studies have been done. We did the first big nationwide study and published it in 1990.
I like the idea that you call it home education instead of homeschooling. And I'm not sure that that was a popular term at that time. Is there a reason why you said home education instead of homeschooling when you titled this
Yes, there is.
research?
There is, when I say modern homeschoolment, just so the audiences, people listening, I mean about 40 years ago. That's what I kind of call the beginning of the modern homeschool movement. At that time, we were not using the word homeschooling necessarily. And in fact, the bibliography that I started during those doctoral studies in the 80s, it's still called, and I called it Home-Centered Learning Annotated Bibliography. And then other people, especially in Europe, were calling it home education. One of the first nationwide magazines in the United States called it home education. And to answer your question, education is typically a broader term, and it typically helps people think about more than just test scores and math curriculum. It's more like the complete instruction and upbringing of a child. It's morals, it's ethics, it's attitude, it's kindness, it's arithmetic, it's writing skills, it's spelling, it's everything. And that really is what most people were talking about at the beginning of the modern homeschool movement. That's what people were doing for thousands of years. They were educating their children in all areas of life, and it was called education. It's a lot of fun. If you go to Webster's 1828 dictionary online, it's a great dictionary. And I'd say your audience should just go look at the definition of education. It's a very, to use a more modern term, like the hippies and all back in the 70s, a more holistic term. And that's good. It's a philosophically rich term. It's a biblically correct term. So that's my answer on that.
Well, that was a great answer. I actually was nudged by my friend Sam Sorbo. We've done a few interviews with Sam, and of course, she's written a great book on homeschooling. And she's the one that encouraged me to not call it schooling anymore, that schooling was very different than education. So I really like that you saw that at the onset when you began with your research. So, NHERI describes itself as a clearinghouse for homeschool research, producing studies, serving as a resource hub, and educating the public. What kind of impact have you seen NHERI had on just the homeschooling community, but beyond?
Yeah. You know, the Bible says don't brag about yourself. So I'll just I'll try to tell you what other people have said. Like I said, we did the first big nationwide study, and I want to give a lot of credit, not necessarily in the research realm, but the value of research. Uh, it is from my worldview. I'm a Christian, and we use science to get at the truth. We observe things. We put together data. We do induction and we do deduction and we hypothesize. But kind of in the end, you're making observations and try to get at the truth of what's going on in the world. And so we want to know what is going on with this modern home education or homeschooling movement. And the credit I want to give is way back, Mike Ferris, an attorney who started the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. A lot of your audience, I hope, knows what that is, HSLDA. Mike said, probably around 1989, he said, we need homeschool parents to do two things. We need them to take their children down to the local state capitol, hopefully well-behaved children, and meet their legislators and get to know them as human beings. You know, remember, this is back when a lot of people thought homeschoolers were really weird, really freaky, really fringy, either left-wing Birkenstock wearing, blow up the TV goat herders or right-wing Bible thumpers. You know, there was a lot to do. And he said, number two, we need good, solid, dependable research to help us know the truth about what's going on with home education. Like I said, a few more studies were starting. And then at that point, NHERI did the big nationwide study. We collected demographics on families. It was back in the olden days when we mailed out thousands of paper envelopes with paper surveys in them. And we collected it back, analyzed the data, homeschool students' test scores. And now to kind of finally answer your question, I'm sorry, I almost always have long answers. It had a huge impact on the public perception of homeschooling. It had a big impact on policymakers. It had an impact on people who were debating sort of philosophical claims, negative and positive about home education. And, you know, what we found basically was a lot of these people are just regular Americans. They're anywhere from lower income to high income. They're anywhere from lower parent formal education to high parent formal education. Uh, they're at that time disproportionately white Anglo, but we could talk about that later. And their children are scoring very high, above average on standardized tests. They don't need to by law teach to standardized tests, but their children are doing well. And these are without parents who are government certified teachers. Only, in fact, only about, as I recall from that study, only about 10% of those parents had ever been government certified teachers, and yet their children are learning how to read, write, do arithmetic, and they're interacting in their communities. So when the media saw that and the policymakers saw that and other parents who are interested in homeschooling saw that, it upped the positive impression of homeschooling quite a bit.
All right, so that was a brilliant idea that Mike Ferris had, and it fell into your lap, and I can see how that would be advantageous to selling it to policymakers and media, others who had this false impression. And I remember the homeschool movement. I've talked to other guests about this. I remember when my children were in school. They're now in their late 30s. I met a lady who was home educating her children, and I thought to myself, oh my gosh, she must be really, really smart, to be able to know all those subjects. And it was such a foreign concept back then. And of course, the biggest criticism you always heard was that children aren't properly socialized. And we know now that that's a huge myth and has been disubstantiated. So, and I just want to mention too, you mentioned the Webster's 1828 dictionary. It's such a great resource. I actually have it on my bookshelf rather than online. I didn't realize it's online, but I'm going to recommend it to others online. And we wrote a curriculum around definitions from that, an abstinence until marriage curriculum using the definitions from 1828. So great resource. I appreciate you bringing that to our attention. So, Dr. Ray, critics often question whether homeschool research can be objective because NHERI is rooted in the homeschool movement itself. So how do you ensure research integrity and protect your credibility?
Yeah. So let's start off with a philosophical context. And the philosophical context is every single researcher at every university, every think tank in the United States and all over the world has a worldview, whether he or she recognizes it, whether he or she admits it. Everybody has some kind of filter of values and beliefs that help motivate what questions they ask of the world in their scientific endeavors, how they collect data, how they analyze data, how they report the findings, and especially, Sherry, how they interpret those findings to the world and how they use those findings to talk about policy. So that's an extremely important context. Okay, so with that said, NHERI and the researchers associated with it, we do not hide that we have beliefs because everybody has beliefs. Now, to protect the integrity, we do our best to use high standards of research. In other words, I've written an article on this, by the way, about what is good research. I used to teach research methods courses at the undergraduate college level and the graduate university level. So, good research, this is a real short thing. You have a topic, you have a question, you maybe have an hypothesis, you lay out your methods for how you did the study, how you collected the data, you explain how you analyze the data if it's a quantitative study, or even if it's a qualitative study. And then you explain how you summarize the data, and then you give your, recommendations, or maybe you say, hey, this is how you could use this to influence policy, but you're honest about it. And then if you follow that protocol and you are clear about what you've done, that's a good study. Now, some people might say, well, that has limitations, and well, you didn't look at this and you didn't look at that. In a good study, in the report, you explain what you did not do, what you could not do. Then on top of that, if you want to go a little further, and this does not necessarily make your research better, but the world, the system of research likes it when you get into a peer-reviewed journal. So that means you send your paper, now that you've finished it, to a journal. The editor sends it out to a couple of other, or maybe 3 other peers, that's the peer review, who are supposed to know how to do research. They make comments, criticisms. Then the editor, in the end, either rejects you outright or says, well, how about you revise this? and then, maybe we'll accept it, and then they accept it. So that's called a peer-reviewed journal. Many of our studies are in peer-reviewed journals. So that also helps with the way the world thinks and works. So those are ways that we maintain the integrity. We'll just be honest. When I was doing a study a few years ago, and this turned out to be sort of a watershed study on the abuse and neglect of homeschooled children compared to the abuse and neglect levels of non-homeschooled children. I thought about and planned that study for over 10 years, Sherry, and I talked with a lot of people about it. It's a very sensitive subject. It's a very difficult subject. You might know that sometimes in the newspapers, news stories pop up, and it's a way that often the homeschool movement is attacked, whether rightfully or wrongfully. And people ask me, well, Brian, Dr. Ray, what if you find some negative things? And I said, if it's the truth, I'm going to report it, and then we'll deal with it. And whether you're a homeschool parent or a homeschool advocate or a critic or a negative critic or an attacker of home education, you got to deal with the truth and then say, what does it mean? So that's how you maintain the integrity of your research.
Okay, I understood a lot of that, Dr. Ray, because again of my experience in abstinence education, or what we like to call abstinence until marriage education. We provided programming and were evaluated, and we had a very difficult time getting published in peer-reviewed journals. I think primarily because there was great evidence to what we were doing was working, and the left doesn't want to see that. And I think the left really controls most of these peer-reviewed journals. So I think it's a wonderful thing that you have been published, and I imagine it was a bit difficult initially. Did you get some pushback when you were first attempting to get published in peer-reviewed journals?
Absolutely. And that's why I said, I don't know if you caught that. In the world's way of doing things, the peer-reviewed journals are, you get more prestige, you get more weight, all those things. But I'll say this, simply because something is in a peer-reviewed journal does not necessarily mean it's of value or well done. There's a lot of really horrible stuff. There are a lot of things in peer-reviewed journals that make no sense, and from a, for example, biblical worldview, are completely trash. Or even from, say, a classical libertarian worldview, they are junk. So worldview does have an impact, and it does have an impact on editors. I'm not going to get too specific here, but if you're doing solid quantitative work and you can find a journal that's relatively fair, then you can get published. But if you're getting more into social things like you were, where the worldview becomes even more obvious, you're going to have a really difficult time. And yes, I have had some troubles in some of these articles or manuscripts that I've submitted where, let's say at the end, like after the data, after the findings, then I get a little more philosophical and policy oriented, which quote, they, people who are socialists and statists, do all the time. But when I put some of that in from my worldview, that got nixed real fast. And I had to leave it out of the manuscript or it would have never got published. So yes, that has happened.
Okay, we need to take a short break, but when we come back, I'd like to ask you about NHERI's future as you celebrate 35 years of work. Don't go away. I'll be back with my interview with Dr. Ray right after this. A January 2025 New York Times survey revealed that the vast majority of Americans, including many Democrats, oppose allowing biological males to compete in female sports. Yet despite this public consensus, in June 2024, a boy athlete won gold in female track and field events at a California high school championship. This is just one example of the harm caused to girls when males are allowed to compete in their sports. Many girls lose out on rightful athletic achievements, and their private spaces, including showers and locker rooms, are invaded by boys suffering from gender dysphoria, a recognized mental health disorder. U.S. Parents Involved in Education respectfully urges the protection of female sports in private areas from policies that put girls at risk or undermine their accomplishments. For more information and to join our movement, visit uspie.org and connect with us at USPie on Facebook and X. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few, and with me today is Dr. Brian Ray, the founder and president of the National Home Education Research Institute. This year marks an impressive milestone, NHERI's 35th anniversary. Congratulations, Dr. Ray. So
Thank
what
you. It's really good.
Absolutely. It's amazing, I think, that you have been doing this for this long. And so what does the anniversary mean to you personally, and what does it say about the longevity and value of homeschool research overall?
It means a few things, not necessarily in this order priority wise. It means that people highly value research. They want numbers, policymakers, legislators, whether they personally are sort of pro alternatives and pro private education, or whether they really don't like private education. They want numbers. It helps them have a reason for their position in the state houses, the legislatures. So it's very important. I've had many homeschool people and others tell me, hey, they want new data. Nowadays, we used to say if research was under 10 years old, it was kind of new. But now with the internet and everything so fast, man, if it's over about 2 years old, they think it's old news. So they want new information to inform thinking and policy. So that's one thing. It also tells me that God is very faithful. I think that this was a good thing to do. Others think it was a good thing to do 35 years ago, and it's still a good thing to do. It tells me that I've had fun. I enjoy research. Ever since I was a child, I've loved watching animals and observing animals, and in the end, seeing what's going on in the world and what's true and trying to make sense out of patterns. So that's good. I also see now, talking with a lot of folks, watching what's going on in the world, especially lately, it seems like the last couple of years, a surge in negative attacks on homeschooling in terms of law. There are people who are clearly, and people say, Brian, don't be so blunt about worldview names. You've got to be blunt sometimes, especially in a 1 hour, presentation like this. There are people with different worldviews. There's a classical libertarian worldview. There's a neo-Marxist worldview. There's a socialist worldview. There's a statist worldview. There's a biblical scriptural worldview. There's an Islamic worldview. There's a Baha'i worldview. Now, there are a lot of overlaps between these, but there are people who really, really believe that the civil government should have first and final authority over a child's life. One of the great values of a research institute that does not hide its worldview, but says, hey, let's look at the objective facts here. And the objective facts have been showing consistently the people who choose to not put their children in government schools, have them in private institutional schools or homeschooling, are doing very well. They should be, there's no reason, there's no problem that the civil government needs to solve to try to fix them and change them and control them. The statists and socialists tend to use words, they try to make it sound a little nicer, like accountability and regulation. But what those really mean are the C word, control. So when I look at the future of research on home education and NHERI, the Research Institute, we need to keep plugging away, doing good, solid, dependable research to let people know the truth about what's happening with home educated children. And so far, Sherry, and this is not just my research, you use the word clearinghouse. We are a clearinghouse of research. So we follow basically all research being done on homeschooling. And so far, when it comes to things like academic achievement, which is supposedly important to the public, supposedly important to legislators, when we look at social and emotional development, when we look at success in adulthood or not, when you look at a lot of studies by many different researchers, not just me, researchers with different worldviews and biases. Over half of those studies, around 60%, 65% on academic achievement, social emotional development in peer-reviewed journals show that the home educated are doing better than those in institutional schools. About half of the studies show that the home educated are doing better in adulthood on various measures than those in institutional schools. So, an institute, a think tank like NHERI, is extremely important to keep this information front and center. We have a few competitors who have different worldviews, and I'll tell you, they put very different angles and spins on information, and they either lean lightly or strongly towards statism, and that is the civil government has first and final authority over children. And people say, "What are you talking about, Brian?" You can see this one of the places the clearest, and I've complimented this author, Dr. James Dwyer, a professor. He wrote a book, and he said in there, he's a philosopher. He said one of his presuppositions, I'm paraphrasing, is that the state, the civil government, has that first and final authority over what is good for children. And I wrote to him, I said, I totally disagree with you, but you were honest and you put it up front. And he said, "Thank you, Brian." We go on from there. So we need a research institute that has a worldview that understands these things and presents it to the world. So we are really working now, striving hard to be ready for another 35 years. One of the great things is that God has brought more researchers, research associates to NHERI to work together now as a team. And as Brian Ray is still loving it, but he does have a gray beard. And so we're looking to the future and we have more studies planned. We're doing things. We're trying to develop more of a following and a support system, money, funding. We don't take tax dollars. These state universities are getting millions and millions of dollars of your money, tax dollars, and many of them have been putting out horrible research.
And that does not surprise me. Um, so you mentioned at the beginning of that response how homeschooling is being attacked like never before, and I've heard that other places. In fact, my friend Emily Fort, she used to be Door. You probably are familiar with her father. She's been contracted in the last year or two to start a new homeschool freedom coalition, and they're being proactive in fighting in some of these states where there are threats to the freedom of home education. And I can understand probably why that's happening because we see so many parents withdrawing their children from the government school system. And I imagine there's been a huge increase in home education. Can you speak to the increase? I mean, there has been in the last couple years, I believe.
Yes, we were watching, if anybody goes to our website, NHERI.org, right up front, we have a fact sheet that we're constantly updating. And the growth was steady, steady, steady from the, 1980s till about 5 years ago. Then it did pop up. There was a big blip in the bar graph right there around the government lockdowns of schools. And my estimate put it up to around 3.1 million children. It dropped off noticeably after that. I have not done a real careful estimate since the last few years, but I'll just do a rough, wild guess here, okay? It is like, take this for what it's worth. I would wildly guess maybe that's up around 4 million now. Some homeschool advocates think it's a lot higher, but they haven't proven it to me with numbers. And I'm a researcher, right? So I'm supposed to follow the numbers. I'm working on a new estimate right now, by the way. But it has, as far as we can see, continued to grow over the last few years. I'm not talking by huge leaps and bounds, but there's steady increase. Some people think, well, that must mean the public school enrollment's crashing. It's not. Some people might want it to. It's not crashing, but it is decreasing. But like you said, a lot of people in the government school system are very upset because they often see it as a loss of money. What they won't say for many of them, it's a loss of power and influence over children's minds and hearts, as all education is, by the way, not just public schooling, private schooling, homeschooling, public schooling, all are the teaching, training, and indoctrination of children. So, yes, I believe the numbers are increasing. We have evidence of that. I'm not going to give you a rock solid number right now. Hopefully, within a month, I'll have one.
All right, that sounds great. We'll look forward to hearing about it when that new research comes out. So, Dr. Ray, you've done dozens of studies over the years. What are some of the most relevant research projects and that you've published? What stands out in your mind?
Well, I have to say, I'll always remember the 1991. That was the first big one of its kind.
Right.
Uh, since then, Sherry, we've done, I don't know the exact number. I think we're now on the fifth or sixth iteration, so to speak, of a nationwide study like that. So, 2 years ago, we collected data for the first time in about 15 years, a new nationwide study. And this will give everybody a sense of how long it takes things to get published. So we collected those data 2 years ago. Just now, probably around January, February, uh, that study will be published in uh, two different presentations in two different peer-reviewed journals. So it takes a long time, and that's why, again, we need support at a research institute, a private research institute. So we're working on that. We just finished another iteration of a nationwide study. It'll probably be another 2 years before we come out with that. Another study that stands out around, oh my goodness, it's now 11 years ago. I got this idea, others thought it was a good idea, and I did the first ever study, nationwide study of Black families, African American families homeschooling, similar to my other nationwide studies on academic achievement. And that was so fascinating and fun. Uh, a lot of people assume, oh, he's doing a study on Black homeschoolers. He must be a Black man. No. And then some people accused me of racism. I couldn't figure out why. I had to talk with people, but we did the study. And this is what happened. These children, okay, so I do not like the word race. I don't think it's a biblical term, but children of this ethnicity, skin color, and so forth, in public schools, where are they on the totem pole of academic achievement? Everybody knows. Bottom, near the bottom. They're at the bottom. Barely above them would be Hispanic children. Average would be white Anglo. And then I ask people, and then who's above that? And everybody knows Asians. It's almost like a joke. Well, in this study, the Black homeschooled children are scoring on standardized tests far better than Black children in public schools and just as well as white Anglo children in public schools. So that was really fun. I put that out to all kinds of outlets, a lot of organizations who say they care about Black children. How many of them do you think contacted me, Sherry?
None.
Zero, zero, none. That was
Mm-mm.
a really fun study, and it's had a big impact. It's been read a lot. And then I would say, I mentioned this study earlier. I'll mention one more. The one that Dr. Denise Shaquille and I did 2 or 3 years ago on abuse and neglect, comparing the homeschooled to the non-homeschooled. Very touchy, very important subject. And that has made a lot of news. And the fact that there was no less abuse and neglect in the public school children has had a huge impact on policy, especially people who've been attacking homeschoolers and say, hey, look, the evidence we have so far, no difference or a little safer, perhaps, being homeschooled. That's had a huge impact.
I imagine it has, because I've heard that criticism as well. I've heard it recently, in arguments by policymakers. So, you've mentioned a couple of times children doing well, home education children doing well on standardized tests. So, help me understand that a little better because I'm very familiar with standards. I was a big opponent of the Common Core standards that were pushed on states back in 2010. And so, if they're doing well on the tests that are based on the standards and they're not being taught the standards, how does that work?
Yeah, that's a great complicated question. So, first of all, I want to tell everybody, especially parents, how your child scores on a standardized test is not NOT. the most important thing in the world. It's just a piece of information. And from a biblical worldview and other philosophical worldviews, do not let standardized tests run your life or your child's life. Now, at the same time, they are used in this world, and it's kind of a common currency people talk about. And you want to go to college, you have to take a standardized test, probably. Uh, so, Sherry, some of these nationwide standardized tests have, I don't know a lot about this, but they have been influenced by things like Common Core. Others have been far less influenced. The publishers have been far less influenced. So some of these publishers are still the good old fashioned basic stable stuff or concepts. Can the child basically read and understand what he's reading? Can she do basic math or advanced math and understand what she's doing in her math? And, can she spell or can he write a basic essay? Some of it's relatively safe and not danger to people with perhaps a biblical worldview. So, for example, Bob Jones University Press uses the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. It's pretty good at just getting at the basics. But these are nationally normed. So, if a child is, quote, sixth grade in public school, there's an average score for the reading, writing, arithmetic, right? So then if a homeschool child takes the test and scores the same, he's at the 50th percentile. But here you have homeschool families who do not need to follow public school curriculum. They do not need to follow what maybe a publisher thinks is important. And yet their children are doing well above average. So I think what that says is that whatever homeschoolers are doing, and this is a whole nother hour conversation what they're doing. It's exceeding it's exceeding for sure what is being done in your basic institutional government run school. Now, I'm not saying that's a great success, but homeschoolers don't have to do better to be left alone. I mean, they don't even have to be doing as well. It's a private education. But the reality is, research is showing that on average, they're doing better, whether their parents have high formal education, low formal education, wealthy, not so wealthy, brown skin, light skin, whatever colored skin, Democrats, Republicans, Christians, atheists, Jews. There's a lot about home-based education run by the parents that is systemically excellent for children.
Okay, that was a great answer. It is a complicated question. It's one that I've actually asked um, of others, who are involved with, like, for example, the classic charter schools that Hillsdale has been, and I'm not sure if they're still doing that, but a few years back they were doing that. And it was a question I asked to one of their leaders. How can you do well with a classical education if you're required to teach the Common Core standards, which charter schools are government schools. Most people don't understand that they're not
They are.
private. They have maybe a few privileges that other government schools don't. But so anyway, I thought you answered that very well. He had a similar answer. So what studies are you planning in the next few years? You've already talked about some that you've finished and they'll be published soon, but what's on the horizon?
So right now, this new nationwide data collection, I know it's not new, but it's new. It's another study. We'll be working on that probably for at least a couple of years. Uh, I have worked on a paper called Defining Homeschooling and Why It Matters. And this is I believe, a very important concept. It's, in a way, it's an historical, philosophical, and research-oriented paper. In the last 5 years or so, some people, sadly, some people in the homeschool world, and some academics have been, in a sense, trying to redefine homeschooling such that the definition becomes so broad, it's meaningless. And if you call everything a rose, it's meaningless now to talk about your rose garden. If a rhododendron's a rose, if a trillium's a rose, it doesn't make any sense to talk about roses anymore. So I'm basically going back and looking at, here's the bottom line, Sherry. home-based, this is homeschooling, parent-controlled, home-based, privately funded private education. That's a core definition. Now, I realize there are some people who are taking some tax dollars now. I realize there's some people are saying, well, hey, if I have my children in a place we call school 3 days a week and they're at home 2 days a week, we're still calling that homeschooling. That defies thousands of years of what we now call homeschooling was. It also defies about 35 years of the history of modern homeschool movement. So this is really important philosophically, politically, legislatively, and I'm working to try to get that into a peer-reviewed journal so that it gets more widely read. That's a project. Another project is, and this is kind of a dream. I can't say it's happening yet. We need funding, but one of the negative criticisms of what research tells us, and this is a limitation of research. It's not a flaw, okay? There's a difference. Limitation, almost all social science research has limitations. But people say, all right, yeah, I've been 35 years of research and researchers, Ray and others keep finding these positive things about homeschooling, but we really don't know whether homeschooling causes these positive things. So one way to get at that, Sherry, would be what's called a matched pair design, where you get one set of students uh, who have been maybe in public school for 8 years, and you get another set who have only been home educated for 8 years, and you make sure that they're kind of matched up on economics, household income, parent education level, ethnicity, all these basic factors, and then you give them brand new testing, and you see how they do. Uh, I think that would be fascinating. No one's ever done that at that scale. Uh, it doesn't sound real exciting to some people, uh, but I think it would be sort of like I don't know, a little bit of the cream on the top of a lot of these studies, and it might help stop some of the fuss that homeschooling doesn't help really. Hey, but here's the deal. What if we did this quote perfect study and found no difference in their test scores? Think about this. No government certified teacher, no university school of education trained teachers, no government approved curriculum, no tax dollars from your neighbors of $18,000 per child, and the children did just as well. That's a huge story in itself. So those are some of the things. There's another study I don't really want to talk about because I don't want to give a secret to somebody who might try to interfere with the study, but it would be another one related to this claim that home educated children are at so much risk of harm from their parents. Uh, I think there's another study that could be done on that that would be very important, but I don't want to say much more than that.
Okay, well, that sounds exciting. I'm looking forward to hearing more about your research and these new projects. You talked about redefining home education, and it's sparked a memory for me. When I hear people talking about home education today, what you described, where they go to school a couple of days and stay home a couple of days, I've heard it described as the hybrid model. So you're absolutely right. There are um, a myriad of programs out there now that call themselves home education, and I've never really thought about how it might actually be um, diluting the whole concept of home education. So
Now,
it's a very good point.
Sherry, it's okay, so I want to put this out there. It's not like a judgment. It's not like a negative judgment on a family that, hey, look at it this way. Let's say a family's had their children in government run schools for 3 years, 6 hours per day, 5 days a week, and they say, hey, this looks doable to us. Like, okay, this looks good. Like, we could have them in this small school 3 days a week, at home 2 days a week, without getting all the details. That might be a wonderful, wonderful change for that family. It's alternative schooling. Just call it what it is. Back in the 70s, 60s, we had alternative schooling. We had open schools, schools without walls. We had Summerhill in England. It's an alternative form of schooling. Just keep it that. That's fine. Call it schooling. But to say that uh, 3 days a week in a place called school with uniforms, or 2 days with uniforms and a curriculum controlled by that school, and then home 2 or 3 days a week is homeschooling. That's a complete, I don't want to use the wrong word here, degradation and misrepresentation of what home education is. So just be honest. And if it's gotten to the point where your children being their education is being tax funded and the state has control in a way over that school at home, call it public school at home, or call it tax funded school at home. You don't need to call that homeschooling. You don't need to call it that.
Oh, I like that. Tax funded schooling at home. I'm going to steal that
Yeah, that's what
term.
it is. It's tax funded schooling at home. And whenever this is really important also, Sherry, that I want everybody to get this. Uh, if I or you take a single tax dollar from the government, which they took from your neighbors, you should be controlled. You should be regulated by the
Mm.
government. We don't want the government to spend $89 on a hammer for the army when they could have got it for $19. We want control and regulation over how our money's spent. So when people say, well, we'll just take tax dollars and school at home and we're not going to have any government regulation, that's wrong. You have to have government regulation. You should have government regulation because that is not your money. So that's part of why I say that. I try to make it really clear for people that if I take tax dollars, I need to be controlled by the government.
Wow, that's a great point too. That's the first time I've heard that. I'll definitely be using that as well. Because our
Think about
organization.
this, Sherry. We have
Okay.
we have food welfare. This is tax funded education welfare. Public schooling is education welfare. And
Mm.
when we start saying we're going to take tax dollars now to send to a private school or a homeschool, that's an expansion of tax funded education welfare to private schooling and schooling at home. There's no way to get around it. It's like people are embarrassed. They don't like me to use that word, but it's the truth. You know, people of my parents' generation, they knew what welfare was. And many of them during the Depression and World War II, they did not want to take welfare. That was supposed to be for a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of people in great need. But this expansion of education welfare is exactly that. It's an expansion of tax-funded education welfare to put more and more children under taxes in private schools and schooling at home. You will eventually have to raise taxes, and there should be, not could be, should be government control.
Couldn't agree more. Very well said. And again, I'm taking notes. I'm going to be using those lines for sure because you're right. It's absolutely true. We've actually referred to it as an entitlement, but I think you're right. I think welfare is a much stronger definition for that. And our organization agrees with you that we shouldn't be putting government money into private and home education because of the inherent control that goes with it. And your point is really well made. um, they should be controlled. If they're taking our
Yeah.
money and using it for that purpose, then we want to make
Hmm.
sure it's the most efficient, practical use of
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
funding.
And let's take a step back since we do get to be philosophical here. If anybody says, well, professes to be, say, a classical liberal libertarian, or somebody says, I'm a Christian, I look to the scripture first, you're not going to find any argument in the scripture for taking your neighbor's money by force to teach, train, and indoctrinate your child. And sure, I'd really like Christians to think about that. So that's actually the discussion to have before the discussion of government control. That is the presuppositional conversation that most, well, I won't say that. A lot of Christians don't want to talk about.
Right. You're absolutely right. Amen to that. So, Dr. Ray, we need to take another short break, but when we come back, I'd like to ask you two questions I ask all my guests before closing the show. Don't go away. I'll be back with my interview with Dr. Brian Ray right after this. LGBTQ is an acronym widely used, but the T portion related to transgender issues has caused serious harm in schools. Consider the Jane Doe lawsuit from Rhode Island, where a mother alleges her daughter was secretly transitioned by school staff and later attempted suicide. The school used social-emotional learning surveys that asked personal questions about the child's gender identity and feelings. The daughter was presenting as a boy at school while remaining a girl at home and was encouraged to keep the transition hidden from her mother. This heartbreaking case highlights the dangers of gender transitions without parental consent. U.S. Parents Involved in Education opposes these practices and advocates for parental rights and student safety above all. For more information and to join our movement, visit uspie.org and connect with us at USPie on Facebook and X. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few, and with me today is Dr. Brian Ray, the founder and president of the National Home Education Research Institute. We close our show with two important questions. So, Dr. Ray, what concerns you most about what's happening in education today, and what gives you hope?
Still, many people, again, whether they are of the philosophy of Buddhism or atheism or Christianity or whatever, they still do not recognize that when they turn their children over to government schools or public schools, they are being taught, trained, and indoctrinated into a certain way of thinking and reality for 6 hours per day, 5 days per year. And they, in a sense, want to ignore that. I am still concerned. I've actually had parents tell me this. The public school for them is a free babysitter. That really saddens me for any parent. Now, what gives me hope is that an increasing number of people are understanding that point, the first point, and an increasing number of people are not trusting the civil government to teach, train, and indoctrinate their children. And they're looking for really good alternatives. And that is a very hopeful thing. I'm also very glad to see that within the homeschool community, there are some wonderful, amazing, strong philosophical thinkers and freedom fighters, just like there were 30 years ago. Sometimes us older people think they're gone, but they're still there, and I am meeting them.
That's awesome. That's a great hope. Gives me hope also. So tell us one more time before we close your website and where people can find your research.
Very simple, NHERI.org. NHERI.org. And if you go way to the bottom of the homepage, you can sign up for free homeschool research news. We will not send you a bunch of junk email.
Awesome. And I encourage our audience to do just that. So thanks again for being on the show. I really appreciate your time today, and I'd love to have you back on, 3 or 4 months down the road, and we'll hear more about your research that's going to be released. Thanks again. And to our listeners, if you found today's discussion eye-opening, please share this episode with a friend, give us a 5-star rating, and subscribe to stay informed. You can connect with us on Facebook and X at USPie and visit uspie.org to join the movement. Until next time, I'm Sherry Few. Thank you for your support of USPie and our efforts to unmask government schools.
U.S. Parents Involved in Education is a nonprofit coalition dedicated to restoring local control of education and parental authority. By empowering parents to reclaim responsibility for their children's learning and encouraging states to move away from federal influence, USPie seeks to create a culture where parents are the primary decision makers in education and schools support families without the burden of federal mandates. If you want to start a state or regional USPie chapter in your area, please visit uspie.org and complete the brief questionnaire in the chapter section.